Mr. Speaker, I have the honour and privilege to rise to address this House on the Appropriation Bill for the third time, and will be dealing with the following areas of responsibility: justice, planning, transport and traffic. I'm looking forward to an uninterrupted delivery, Mr. Speaker, if all honourable members agree. Let me first thank the Honourable Deputy Chief Minister for agreeing to rejig the order of speeches, as a result of which I will be speaking in reply to the Government's addresses on planning, justice and transport, leaving only traffic to come after me. I remain unsighted in that regard, and I'm wary of the possibility that there's likely to be announcements on findings or initiatives stemming from the Sustainable Traffic and Transport Management Plan, which may be significant and that I will not have the opportunity to address in this debate. I deal first with justice, Mr. Speaker. In first place, I would like to associate myself with the comments of the Honourable Minister for Justice in relation to Justice Barrington Black and Justice Jack. It's almost as if he did that on purpose to confuse the House, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Honourable Minister for his contribution in respect of that particular portfolio, and take this opportunity to acknowledge that despite there being clear blue water between members on either side of this House in relation to a number of issues, I can happily say that my dealings with the Honourable Member have been nothing but courteous, focused on the issues and generally positive. I am grateful to the Honourable Member for affording me that courtesy. It has been also a pleasure to work opposite him in relation to the various bits of legislation that we have worked on. And developments in relation to the justice portfolios are many and varied, many, if not most of which, are welcome equally on both sides of the House. The Honourable Member will recall the exchange earlier this year in relation to prison occupancy figures, as well as my acknowledgements and congratulations in relation to the very positive developments those represented. The passing in this House of the Companies Insolvency Act recently is another accomplishment worthy of congratulations. I am particularly pleased to note the announcement this afternoon by the Honourable Minister in relation to the proceeds of crime legislation, an issue that I had certainly dealt with on a number of occasions in the past, not least last year during the budget speech, where it was received rather interestingly by the government members. I am also happy to learn of the communications and data surveillance legislation that the Minister has announced. I think it won't have escaped any of the members here that the threat of terrorism is ever present, particularly in the context of recent developments in Iraq and the news that many British men are now participating in the aggression in Iraq, and the threat that itself represents in terms of their brutalization and return to the UK. So again, I welcome that. Although there are many areas of common ground between us, Mr. Speaker, there is one issue in respect of which we do not seem to agree, and one which I move on to deal with. The GSLP Liberal Manifesto contains a commitment to increase the limits of qualification for legal aid and assistance, and to explore other mechanisms to ensure citizens have appropriate legal representation when they need it. It goes on to say, and I quote, "Although there is a draft bill already, these have not been increased for many years, and a lot of people who should be eligible and need legal aid or assistance are not getting the cover." The long and the short of it, Mr. Speaker, is that they have failed to deliver this commitment so far, and instead made changes to our legislation which have effectively handed the benefit of gold-plated legal assistance to a handful of defendants in one high-profile case, ignoring the plight of all the rest of, as he said it, a lot of people who should be eligible and need legal aid or assistance, but who are not getting the cover. It is not like we haven't made an issue of this either, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition, when he shadowed this portfolio, raised the issue in questions to the Minister in February 2012, generally about the reform, that the government was contemplating, and specifically following the publication of the legal aid amendment rules in June 2012. The Minister confirmed that it would affect just that handful of defendants in cases caught within the definition of exceptionally complex cases involving fraud. In the budget debate that year, the Honourable Mrs. I.M.L. Law-Hammond alluded to the plight of single parents in saying that, and I quote, "Despite my honourable friend Mr. Feetham having prepared legal aid reform legislation waiting to be implemented, it is shocking that this government has only published new rules to expand legal aid that enables defendants accused of complex fraud crimes to hire expensive specialist lawyers at public expense. No thought has gone into or takes into account the plight of single parents, mainly women, who are not entitled to legal aid if they own the family home or a car. This blanket rule penalises one lone parent struggling with mortgage payments and with paying legal fees in order to pursue erring partners in their duty of care as a parent." End quote. The Honourable, the Leader of the Opposition, as Shadow Minister for Justice in 2012, also alluded to it. Finally, on justice, and I quote, "In relation to legal aid, we simply do not agree with the recent legislative changes made by the government which help a handful of defendants in one fraud case." The Honourable Minister for Justice conceded, indeed, in answer to a question I posed barely 2 months ago, and this is still within the quote, that there were also non-fraud cases which are exceptionally difficult and complex. In the premises, the logic for extending the recent legal aid rules to exceptionally difficult and complex non-fraud cases is, in my respectful view, unanswerable. He went on to say, or ask, why the government has chosen to assist a handful of defendants in a fraud case only they know. But it is certainly not right, or rather, it is certainly not the right, and it is certainly not the fair thing for them to do. We urge the government to therefore do the right thing and extend those rules. In answers to questions, the Honourable the Minister said that they weren't going to reform legal aid in a piecemeal fashion, but with respect, that is in fact exactly what they did. Their failure to bring legal aid reform to this House is all the more mystifying given that they have indeed managed to conduct consultation, draft, publish and pass legislation in relation to many other areas, and yet somehow have so far managed to avoid bringing the bill for legal aid reform to this House. They managed to stretch to issuing amended legal aid rules, effectively granting one group of defendants in one case in the jurisdiction unlimited legal aid. So, Mr. Speaker, they managed to bring, amongst other initiatives, the Smoke-Free Environment Act, the Civil Partnership Act, and the new Companies and Insolvency Act. I mean, no mean feat, but they have not managed to bring before this House a bill for legal aid reform. The Honourable Minister inherited draft legislation which had been prepared in consultation with the industry, and made that draft bill such changes as circumstances or policy dictate today. What it cannot do, with respect, Mr. Speaker, is to take the better part of 3 years in government, reviewing and considering draft legislation, one which the Honourable Mr. Likudi told us he had in February 2012, sit on it, and fail to bring changes to the system which are needed in this community.
Absolutely.
Now, Mr. Speaker, in relation to this, the Honourable the Chief Minister will likely say in his reply that it is the height of hypocrisy that we should be demanding such reform after only 3 years of their government, when the party I form part of was in government for 16 years, and in particular, the Leader of the Opposition was a Justice Minister for the last 4. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that the draft legislation was at an advanced stage of readiness and would already be law had we been returned to office in 2015. What the Chief Minister will likely do is to accept that they've taken too long on this already, but say that that's okay, because the GST never did it in 16 years, Mr. Speaker. As is his style, Mr. Speaker, he will validate his acts or omissions by reference to the omissions he claims himself to deplore. What he will be saying, Mr. Speaker, is that they will continue to take their jolly time until such time when circumstances, whatever those may be, permit them to bring the legal aid reform bill to this House, even if it means, Mr. Speaker, that many in this community continue to suffer the unfairness of being unable to challenge estranged partners who refuse to allow them to have contact with their own children simply because they have a job which helps them to get by, but which excludes them from getting legal assistance. This issue, Mr. Speaker, has been brought to the fore. How very melodical of the Chief Minister. The issue has been brought to the fore not just because general reform is long overdue, Mr. Speaker, but because this government's amendment of the rules to effectively benefit defendants in just one case, yes, one case, ignoring all other possibilities for reform which they could have introduced, simply brought the spotlight to shine brightly on the government's lack of general action in this respect. They've taken one area of legal aid and made a single change by regulations, which has been for the benefit of exceptionally complex cases involving fraud, a euphemism, Mr. Speaker, for one case, just the one case.
Absolutely.
They have made one change that requires, by their own admission, to a regime that requires, by their own admission, wholesale reform. But why, Mr. Speaker? Why? Why haven't they extended this to exceptionally difficult cases not involving fraud? Cases which the Minister himself has accepted in this House do exist. In fact, in a reply to a supplementary question asked by the Honourable and Learned Sir Peter Caruana back in October 2012 as to whether they were going to extend this legal aid benefit to complex cases not involving fraud, the Honourable Minister insisted that his answer was, rather unhelpfully I think you will find, and I quote, "No, we will do it, because we are considering legal aid and legal assistance, reform generally, so we will do it at that time, end quote. That, Mr. Speaker, is rather a confusing position to adopt. What is it that they are going to be doing? Are they going to extend the benefit, or are they merely going to consider it? I take the opportunity to ask the Minister once more, will this government be extending the benefit of the legal aid amendment rules of 2012 to exceptionally complex cases not involving fraud? And if they're not, why not? Last year, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Chief Minister criticised me for not focusing on figures. But with your indulgence, I will regale him with just a handful. The spending by this community on legal aid and assistance in the following financial years was as follows. In 2010-2011, £623,202. In the financial year 2011-2012, the spending was £1,049,863. 2012 to 2013, the financial year after the change to the rules, £2,210,557. In the last financial year, Mr. Speaker, the one that we are here to debate, the expenditure has been £2,659,000 now, Mr. Speaker. I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that the staggering amount of £2.7 million in forecast outturn this year will probably turn out to be significantly more. The estimate for next year, Mr. Speaker, is £1.6 million. I wonder whether, given the circumstances of the near conclusion of the case in point, Mr. Speaker, we will see a significant reduction in the cost to the taxpayer of this one change of rules to cover one group of defendants. How many custody or access hearings could be paid for with £2.7 million, Mr. Speaker? I now turn to planning, Mr. Speaker. I am grateful to the Honourable, the Deputy Chief Minister, for his address in respect of this area of responsibility. Now, Mr. Speaker, the opposition benches are often lambasted for the delivery of set-piece debates, which do not respond to the speeches delivered by the ministers, usually before the opposition members' replies. That is not the case today, and at least in respect of one of my portfolios. Imagine my delight, Mr. Speaker, when, upon hearing the Honourable, the Deputy Chief Minister's intervention, I found I would have to change nothing about this part of my speech, for the simple reason that the Minister had treated us almost literally to a reread of last year's speech. I was able then, Mr. Speaker, to print a copy of the Minister's speech yesterday, which I found in the Hansard from last year, to confirm that, as a matter of fact, little seems to have happened beyond this point last year, which was worthy of note, except, of course, for more meetings of the DPC and applications, the Minister which the Minister reviewed in his figures. But the spending spree continues, Mr. Speaker. The Planning Department's expenditure for the year 2012-2013 was a little over £800,000, and the estimate for the last year was just a little over £1 million. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that they have spent over £1.5 million. Y no había dinero, Mr. Speaker. There was no money. I shudder to think what the Honourable, the Father of the House, makes of the profligacy of the many government ministers spending like there's no tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, I acknowledge that 2.5 years in, and from the beginning of their term of office, the GSLP Liberals have indeed opened up the planning. I hope the Honourable Father of the House has had the opportunity to hear that last comment. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, I do acknowledge that 2.5 years in, and from the beginning of their term of office, the GSLP Liberals have indeed opened up the planning process locally in a manner which we did not contemplate in the GSD's manifesto in 2011. The GSD believed furtively then, as it does today, in the value of a planning process such like it was created by the GSD during their term of office, which allowed objectors to file their objections to projects for consideration by the DPC in closed meetings. Some will recall the demolition of the north gate of the dockyard under the cover of a long weekend by the previous GSLP administration as an example of how things had been done until 1996. The development of the process by the government now includes the expansion of the DPC's membership and the opening of meetings to public. It now publishes minutes of these meetings, although there is still some delay in relation to their publication. It's something that I've raised in the House in the past. And the government runs projects by the DPC for guidance and advice, but nothing more. This policy, Mr. Speaker, has been somewhat hit and miss. It was the Honourable the Speaker's predecessor who presided over the exchange relating to the fiasco with the Grand Battery demolition, which demolition project went before the DPC after the wall had been demolished. A similar and convenient circumvention of rules, which after all don't yet apply to the government, was also the order of the day in relation to and the presentation of Charles Bousson House to a meeting of the DPC. The Deputy to the Chief Minister also cited in his speech this morning 2 projects in his address as examples of the success of this policy: the Sunbourne and the refurbishment of the housing estates. Well, Mr. Speaker, all they do is prove that they paid lip service to the DPC and its concerns in relation to the Sunbourne, but that ultimately that project was completed as it was always going to be, the done deal, Mr. Speaker. As far as the housing estates are concerned, the government wants to rewrite history, much like the Honourable the Chief Minister tried to do yesterday with the GSD's legacy, but to no effect. What the government now calls the start of the public consultation in relation to Laguna, Glasses and Moorish Castle estates was actually a press release, Mr. Speaker, number 455 of 2012, announcing a major refurbishment of housing estates, a statement that set out as another done deal that, and I quote, "there will be an additional residential floor added to above each of the buildings in the 3 housing estates," end quote. It went on, Mr. Speaker, begin quote, "This means that the roof problems being experienced by many of these buildings will finally be tackled once and for all," end quote. Well, that went well, didn't it, Mr. Speaker? The Deputy Chief Minister went on to confirm in that statement that the Cabinet had given the green light to the proposals and that he was very pleased that they were moving forward. No mention of public consultation, Mr. Speaker, none. Just a reference to the fact that they were putting the project before the Commission, not to public consultation. What they then had to do was to backtrack, not for the last time, when the volume of resistance from the tenants' associations and in the social media grew too loud to bear, at which point they succumbed to the populists' approach to any resistance. This, Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the fact that they must have, when they announced the projects, been of the agreed view that their plans were going to deal with a specific need in the community, or at the very least, seemed like a good idea at the time on which they will have had the benefit of input from the government's own advisers. I suppose the taxpayer should now be grateful for the near £500,000 being spent on social media monitoring, Mr. Speaker. Government by social media. It's like a direct line to Convent Place. There's no need to write in. There's no need to have a meeting with anyone in government. I mean, sometimes, Mr. Speaker, I'll be perfectly honest. I recommend to constituents who come and see me with a particular issue or stop me down the street not to raise it in this place, because the last thing I want it to become is a party political weapon, which happens very easily, and then just has the result of it being sidelined. My advice often these days is put it on Speak Freely or whatever Facebook discussion ribbing forum you prefer. The effects are sometimes immediate, Mr. Speaker, but what a terribly dangerous thing that really is. But returning to planning, their signature manifesto commitment in this area, i.e. subjecting government projects to DPC approval, not just for opinion and guidance, one of the many in the list which could have been made a reality with the stroke of a pen, remains elusive. Why is that, Mr. Speaker? Simply because they couldn't run the risk of coming up against refusal of the DPC in respect of any of their many projects. They say that they will make such projects subject to approval within this term of office and as part of the overhaul of the town planning legislation. We say that the delivery of that manifesto commitment has been conveniently and quite cynically tied up with the other developments in town planning practice and legislation to allow them the excuse and, more importantly, the time to get cracking on with the projects. Their wish to retain control over the biggest projects with a community-wide impact, is evident in the application by the GFA, technically not a Government of Gibraltar project, in relation to the Europa Point Stadium. Presented to the community at large as another done deal, the government quickly moved to quell any unrest within the DPC about the impact on Europa Point by stressing that Europa Point is the only plot of land the government will give the GFA. End of discussion. Incidentally, Mr. Speaker, I have to say that my jaw almost fell through the floor when I read Gon's statement in the context of the Europa Point Stadium, suggesting that they were okay with the idea of this gigantic project, all right with the impact it was going to have on the area, yet clearly forgetting the issue that they had had with some random shrubbery back in 2011, when the previous administration sought to beautify the area, and the Honourable Dr. Cortes, Minister for the Environment, who is unfortunately not in the chamber this afternoon, headed the society. The Europa Point Stadium project might as well be a government one because for all the openness of the discussions about it and the televised meetings, interesting though they were, the government is saying it will only, essentially, allow the building of the stadium at that site, and the DPC will probably, on that basis, find itself with no choice but to allow the project to go ahead. To do otherwise could be, given the government's stance, to say no to a Cat 4 stadium in Gibraltar. But, Mr. Speaker, frankly, if it is the Honourable the Chief Minister's view that the stadium should be built at Europa Point, then he is entitled to that view, as he should be entitled, in our view, to steer and sometimes even direct that project should happen in a particular way or in a particular place. That is as much his right as it is his obligation as the political leader of this community. The Chief Minister, however, wants to be able to have it both ways. He appoints the town planner as the chairman of the DPC, but his own projects aren't subject to his and the DPC's approval. He relinquishes control over most applications, but keeps it over the most important projects until he's done starting them. He is at once the generous leader, but cuando conviene, when it is convenient, Mr. Speaker, he can push a project through quickly, as was the case with Charles Brisson House. And although it's not strictly a government project, as I am sure he also hopes will be the case with the Europa Point Stadium. Another of the policies of this government is that the town planner should chair the DPC. The town planner is therefore charged with the responsibility of making decisions which, although well qualified to make, he or she, Mr. Speaker, because this is not about the person of the town planner, whoever that may be from time to time, it is about the office of the town planner itself. The office of the town planner is not politically accountable for making those decisions. An example of the difficulty this raises is found in a planning application for 2,000 square metres of office space, which was rejected back in 2012, on the basis that a member of the Commission had taken issue with the idea of demolition in principle, notwithstanding the conversation that was held, highlighting that the building that would replace the demolished one would be built for purpose, and that the building to be demolished was of little, if any, heritage value. The project was refused on the basis of an in-principle problem with demolition generally. It's not to say, Mr. Speaker, that had the town planner not been the chairman, that the project would have been given the green light. But it would have been down to a political decision taking into account the needs of the community, the impact of the project, and the very urgent need for office space. We would certainly, as was GST policy in 2011, continue to publish minutes of the meetings of the DPC. We would, further, as previewed by our statement on enhanced democracy last week, seek to involve the opposition in the DPC as well. Our policy in respect of leadership of the Commission, however, remains firmly that of returning chairmanship of the Commission to the Minister with, from time to time, responsibility for planning. The GST's policy in relation to the issue of government projects requiring approval of the DPC also remains that government projects should not be made subject to the approval of the DPC, though we will, as a GST government did at the time, take the opinion and advice from the DPC, as this government does now. There can be no denying, however, Mr. Speaker, and honourable members will want to pay attention, that certain changes to the planning process in Gibraltar have been welcomed by the public, in particular, the public meetings of the DPC. On that basis, Mr. Speaker, this party would not seek to turn the clocks back in this respect, and would, in recognition of a new expectation in relation to the public holding of meetings of the DPC, continue with this policy when returned to office in 2015. Because you see, Mr. Speaker, we are not in politics to rule supreme or to leave only our mark on this community. In the same way as we wouldn't, if returned to office, take to Commonwealth Park with a bulldozer and some tarmac as our first act of government. For the sake of tearing down any GSLP legacy projects, we will continue to hold meetings of the DPC in public. The Chief Minister and the Minister for the Environment should rest assured there really is no need for a Commonwealth Park Act as they have proposed. They may be imputing to members on this side of the House their own bad faith, but I can assure them that the gimmick that is the proposed Commonwealth Park legislation is as necessary as it would be effective in the long run. Although I don't shadow environment anymore, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, the Honourable J.J. Nettle, doing such sterling work in this regard, I will deal with Commonwealth Park this morning in response to my comments made by the Minister yesterday for a couple of reasons. Mainly because I shadowed the Minister's portfolio for a while, and secondly because this is a good opportunity to correct some of the misrepresentations which the Minister has made about the GST's position in relation to the park. Mr. Speaker, for the record, and hopefully for the last time, the GST doesn't take and never has taken issue with the idea or concept of the park itself. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it looks very nice. I'll be perfectly honest, I have no issue accepting that. That is not the point. Members opposite have always misrepresented this, probably because they cannot fathom the possibility of the GST not knocking a project per se, or because they prefer to do what they can to ensure that the electorate is unable to make out the nuance of our issues with the park. You see, the point is, Mr. Speaker, that we have only ever taken and continue to take is issue with the fact that they were and continue to be dishonest with the electorate. No había dinero, Mr. Speaker. There was no money. There was nothing left in the kitty, and yet, despite their own play on how many important social and infrastructural issues had been ignored for as long as they claimed, and the Chief Minister's own address to the nation citing the Doomsday Memo, Mr. Speaker, nothing got in the way of commencement of works on the park. A vanity project, if ever there was one, Mr. Speaker. One that I have to say, and have said already, that looks very good, and that I will visit soon on one of my many walks with my family, because I actually enjoy walking, Mr. Speaker. Which brings me on to another point. I may not be an environmentalist, Mr. Speaker, but I do enjoy a casual and leisurely walk or cycle ride either here or across the way in Spain. I get around on my bicycle or when it gets a little too warm on my moped, Mr. Speaker. So not in my car. So although I'm not an environmentalist, Mr. Speaker, and I would never want to be considered one either, it may be that other members present and members of the public will be pleasantly surprised and do well, and probably feel a whole lot better for it, for making just some of the decisions I make on a daily basis, because, as I have discovered, Mr. Speaker, the green way is often the fun and healthy way too. Returning to conclude what I want to say in relation to the park, however, Mr. Speaker, there is no cynicism here, other than that on the government benches. It was them, Mr. Speaker, who knew all along that they would not provide 2 floors of parking under the park, and dealt with it by just adding the proviso in relation to the geotechnical survey, which, Mr. Speaker, they didn't even carry out. They have since been manically playing around with a jigsaw that is Gibraltar to find space for, and I quote, double the number of car parking spaces as there had been in Commonwealth Parade, end quote. Wherever a flat plot of land has appeared in the area, down has gone the tarmac and paint to create temporary car parking facilities. In fact, work seems to be starting on the Marriott, which will give rise to a new shortage, which they will now have to reprovide somewhere else. And if by hounding, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable the Minister for Environment means the questioning and holding to account of ministers in this House, then he can rest assured that we will continue to hound him as he throws the taxpayers' money around as if it grows on trees, Mr. Speaker, on parks and plants and trees and anything else he fancies on a given day. Finally, in relation to the park, Mr. Speaker, and in reply to the Minister's comments yesterday relating to his involvement with Wildlife Gibraltar Limited, and again I say it is unfortunate that the Honourable Minister is not present, but his team is adequately represented. I am grateful that he confirmed that we were only asking pertinent questions and that there had been no suggestion of impropriety, Mr. Speaker. We have noted that he has never taken fees for directorship of the company, Mr. Speaker.
May I intervene on this?
Yes, by all means.
I think it is pertinent if we are going to go, if members are going to go over that ground again of the question of a member having a personal financial interest or not, that I should direct the attention of members to page 76 of Erskine May, and I'm going to quote what is written there. Disclosure and registration of personal financial interest. Now, whenever there is a lacuna in should there be a lacuna in the rules and standing orders of this Parliament, then of course we go by the rules and standing orders of the House of Commons, as explained in Erskine May. The House has 2 distinct but related methods for the disclosure of the personal financial interests of its members. Registration of interest in a register which is publicly available, and declaration of interest in the course of debate in the House and in other contexts. The main purpose of the register is to give public notification on a continuous basis of those financial interests held by members which might be thought to influence their parliamentary conduct or actions. The main purpose of declaration is to ensure that fellow members of the House and the public are made aware at the appropriate time when a member is participating in the proceedings of the House of any past, present, or expected future financial interest which might reasonably be thought to be relevant to those proceedings. So I would ask the honourable member to consider very, very carefully the provisions of Erskine May and then to reflect on whether he should continue to raise the matter. My view is that he should not.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for the indication and for the Chair's assistance in reviewing the relevant parts of Erskine May. I was, in fact, going to say, before the Honourable Chair assisted in the way that Mr. Speaker did, that I was not actually going to revisit his direct interest in the company.
But does the honourable member realise that what was the proper thing would have been for the honourable minister at the appropriate stage in the proceedings of this House, in other words, when the item came up, for him to have declared an interest, if he did have an interest in the matter. He didn't have to do that a week ago. He didn't have to do that at question time. The requirement in Erskine May is that he should do so at the appropriate time in the proceedings, so that members and the public knows where the position is. Now, he is not involved here. He has spoken already. He's not involved. It might be appropriate for the honourable member later in the proceedings, if there is an item of expenditure with reference to Commonwealth Park, to do so.
Mr. Speaker, I rise purely as backbench parliamentarian, and in making this, I do so in the context of the implications of what Mr. Speaker has said for Parliament, and I want to make it very clear that I make absolutely no imputation in relation to the matter as it affects the Minister for the Environment or the facts relating to it. As Mr. Speaker has just read out, Erskine May relates to conflicts in the parliamentary work. The award of a government tender is not parliamentary business. It is business by the executive, by the government, outside of Parliament. And the rules of Parliament do not apply to the conduct of ministers of their work as members of the government outside of Parliament. First point. Second point, it would be, I would urge Mr. Speaker to consider, a most unusual position if the opposition was unable to challenge the government on potential conflicts of any minister in relation to the work of the government and the decisions of ministers in relation to conflicts of interest, not as parliamentarians, but between their functions as ministers and their private commercial interests. Now, I repeat, and I will, every 4 sentences if necessary, but we're all intelligent people, and I don't think I need to, that this has nothing to do with Dr. Cortés or the circumstances that have arisen, about which I express no view. But, yes, of course.
I recognize the way in which he's making the point, and I'm not going to try and speak about that aspect of it, but there is one aspect of how this debate has arisen, which I think is relevant to what Mr. Speaker is saying, and the reason why Mr. Speaker is saying it, which I think the honourable gentleman does not realise, and thence why he's making these points, with which I think we can all agree. It's that Mr. Cortés had spoken about this issue and the award of the tender, etc. And when the issue arose, it was put to him that he hadn't, or that he was asked about an interest. And the point that I made at the time, and I think it's the point that Mr. Speaker is making now, is that in speaking about the award of the tender, if he had had an interest, in other words, in speaking about it here in Parliament, if he had had an interest, then the rule required him to speak to that interest before he continued. And that's how it's all grown. And thence the reason why it's parliamentarily relevant.
May I also add that the Honourable Minister had, of course, discharged his obligation by informing the Clerk of the House with respect to the Register of Interest. He had acted correctly in that respect. So that matter we've reached closure on that. But then the matter was raised of his whether he had a continuing during the course of question time. Okay? Now, he dealt with that matter satisfactorily. He gave an explanation here in the House. I fail to see the need for the honourable member, having regard to what Erskine May has to say, I fail to see the need for the honourable members to revert back to it.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, and if that is your ruling, so be it. I'm sure in the context of this debate, no harm would be done to anybody by just moving on. I repeat, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Chief Minister for the clarification that he has made, a distinction has got to be drawn between the purposes of the chapter from which Erskine May has been cited. Registration of members' interests in the context of parliamentary business means that you don't, if you ask questions on a matter in which you have a financial interest, you could be called up to order, or worse now with the new regime in the UK, if you've not declared an interest in it. And if as a member of the government, or perhaps even as a member of the opposition, if you move legislation, that is the parliamentary business to which I believe that material read from applies. Whether it's capable of being extended simply to participating in a debate, but I think my own personal view, and of course it's for Mr. Speaker to rule and not for me, I'm just expressing a view as an outgoing parliamentarian, that it cannot mean that in a case in which there was the opposition wished to raise, now whether debate is the right place to do it, or whether you will bring a motion, or whether you should ask questions, that's another issue about the appropriateness of the procedure.
I think that in the context of what has happened, if the matter had not been raised during question time, and the minister had in fact had an interest, he would have been obliged during his speech on the estimate to have declared the interest. That would have been the appropriate stage in the proceedings of this meeting. That would have been the appropriate stage in the proceedings of this meeting for him to have declared an interest. The matter arose earlier during question time, and he disposed of the matter.
Mr. Speaker, it's just that I was just going to speak to that question, and your own contribution prevented me from finishing. The point that I'm making is that you cannot, by declaration of an interest, sanitize an act of improper government conflict of interest decision. You're confusing, it's a confusion of one thing with the other. The question of the declaration of interest in terms of the conduct of parliamentary work so that you can then go on to do it, despite your interest, is a wholly different issue to the situation that would prevail if it were to arise, and I repeat, I don't say it does in this case, if there were a genuine case of ministerial abuse of power, it would not be either an obstacle to the opposition to raising it, nor would it sanitize it on the part of the minister that he had declared his interest. I think there's a confusion of two wholly different issues here, and that's the only point I wanted to make.
Mr. Speaker, if I might, I think the honourable gentleman's distinction is absolutely appropriate, and there's no challenge from the part of the government. But you see, he is speaking to an issue which did not arise, and it's not the context in which Mr. Speaker is making the point. There was never any ministerial conflict, because there was never an interest which gave rise to the conflict, and that, I think, has been accepted in the context of this debate. There was, it appeared, the outside of an allegation that the minister had spoken in Parliament about something in respect to which he had an interest without having declared the interest. And the minister's point was to say, when I had the interest, I declared it. When the interest changed, I declared it. I did that before I spoke on the subject. And what Mr. Speaker is saying now is, under Erskine May's rules, therefore, he had nothing to declare in the context of a parliamentary debate. Forget the issue of a ministerial decision, because the issue did not arise. And for that reason, I think Mr. Speaker is absolutely right to bring to our attention that particular paragraph.
If I could just add one thing, and again, if I were to make criticism of this factual situation affecting the Minister of the Environment, it wouldn't be financial corruption. I mean, the point, you don't have to go that far to have a view that it might have been better done differently. And this is a genuine parliamentary debate. I mean, I know that Dr. Cortes and his family and his wife have had a long-standing and very successful, if I might say so, for Gibraltar, association with the Alameda Gardens and many other things. And I suppose it is an extraordinary coincidence that might only happen in a small place like Gibraltar, that such a person could end up being the Minister for the Environment with responsibility for the very same Alameda Garden and other things that he has been interested with. But it nevertheless does provide with a legitimate area for political discourse in which different people, without making any accusations of impropriety against Dr. Cortes, might well have different views. For example, one that just comes to mind to me, which I think cannot be excluded by any idea of registration of conflict of interest, is some people might ask themselves, well, how is the minister going to supervise this agreement? I mean, Dr. Cortes is on one side of the agreement and a member of his close family is on the other side of it. And I had no doubt that he'd find a way of doing it. He'll delegate it to an official and the official will no doubt have. But there are issues which are of bona fide political debate which do not touch on whether there has been impropriety, either in the award process or in Mr. Cortes, the Honourable Dr. Cortes' status as minister, or in the fact that his wife remains a shareholder, or whoever is a shareholder, some member of his family. There are issues of genuine political discourse about whether both sides of the contract are not so closely related that it makes enforcement and administration of the contract, which may not be necessary because it might all be so efficiently done that there's never any disputes. But if there were, how would they be resolved? And I suppose the government would put in place some sort of mechanism to ensure that. And that should presumably would be the government's answer in any discussion on the subject.
Mayor, Erskine May, of course, then goes on. In the section on the register of members' financial interests, there is provision there for the activities, any financial interest of the spouse or partner or any close member of the family. That is also covered in Erskine May, and I do believe, I haven't seen the register of our own register until I made my own declaration at the appropriate time, but I have a feeling that there is also provision. There must be provision there because I was the chairman of the Select Committee at the time, nearly 40 years ago, and it was based, of course, on the register of the House of Commons.
If I might just deal with it, can I just deal with a...
I beg your pardon, Chief Minister. Mr. Speaker's last intervention suggests that either I have not made myself clear in the point that I am making, or that he has ruled, or that he doesn't agree with me. If my point has any merit, the question of the register of members' interests is irrelevant to this matter. To the extent that the register of members' interests is relevant, then my point is not.
I tell you why it isn't. It isn't because the Honourable Minister, in answering the question the other day, made a reference to it. And that is surely uppermost in the mind of the Honourable Mr. Selwyn Figueras. He knows that the Minister did so.
Mr. Speaker, if I might just deal with... I mean, the Honourable Gentleman has raised a point which goes beyond the debate that we're having, which is the issue of ministerial conflict, which I think is the point that I take from him. And what Mr. Cortes was saying in the context of the answer to that question, I think the Honourable Member was not here at the time, was that he had not been involved in the award of the tender. In other words, he was not involved in relation to the tender, which could have given rise to conflict of interest if he had also had an interest in the company, and then he disclosed the issues which related to his interests. So both in terms of the determination of the tender, the ministerial issue, he had not been involved, and second, in terms of the parliamentary aspect of the debate or the question about how that tender had been awarded, he declared the interest as it had been. And I think that deals with both heads. Now, what happens with enforcement? Well, very simple, Mr. Speaker. I mean, the Honourable Gentleman will have come up against this issue on a number of occasions, I'm sure, when he was in government. And there were issues which involved individuals who had relatives that were involved in business. And I'm sure it's very easy for him to understand how it was dealt with. There are rules which deal with conflict. So if one is dealing, for example, with contracts awarded to one's brother-in-law, one enforces those contracts in a way that ensures that one's brother-in-law gets no advantage from the fact that he is one's brother-in-law. And we had a number of instances where successful tenders is too generous a word, where direct allocations of contracts under the previous administration involved, and again, I'm not suggesting there was anything improper, people who had filial relationships, and the rules as to how those contracts were managed would have been those that we adhere to as to conflicts of interest, which I'm sure they were aware of, which is the codes on conflict, which we looked at when we were preparing this ministerial code that we'll be bringing to the Select Committee. It's actually quite easy to deal with those. I mean, the Honourable Gentleman himself had a close relative working with him, and there would have been issues there to be dealt with. So I think the rules are settled as to what you do in that situation. We're going to bring to the Select Committee those rules so that they become the rules of the government as a ministerial code, of the Parliament as a parliamentary code, and of the public service as a public service code.
May I just say, by way of conclusion, I wasn't making a definitive ruling. I was just drawing attention to the provisions of the rules and Erskine May. And I think there is a need to be guided by this, because otherwise there is a danger of overstepping the mark. That is all I was meaning to do. I can make a definitive ruling if members should so wish, but that was not my intention. Intention was to warn the honourable member to keep within the bounds of Erskine May. That is all.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to rehearse any of the arguments either by the Honourable Sir Peter or the Chief Minister, but just simply to say this, that this is the second year in a row that the Honourable, my colleague, Mr. Figueras, has been substantially interrupted in the presentation of his speech. That's the second year.
Interrupted by whom?
May I?
Interrupted by whom?
Mr. Speaker, may I finish?
No. Answer that question before you finish.
Mr.
Who
Speaker,
has interrupted him?
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker has
chair.
interrupted him last year. May I finish?
The chair is entitled to interrupt the most senior member of this House, the father of the House, the Chief Minister, and anybody else should the Speaker consider that he is transgressing the rules of the House. That is what the Speaker is here for. He doesn't have to wait for a member to finish his intervention in order to do so, because the whole purpose was to draw attention. I thought that there was a danger that the Honourable Selwyn Figueras was skating on thin ice, and he may not be aware. He may not be aware. I don't think I was very much aware when I was a member of the provisions of Erskine May, but I am today because it is my business to do so. So I would ask the Leader of the Opposition, because really my intervention, I didn't want to provoke a controversy this afternoon. That was not my intervention. I was given sensible guidance, and I think the Leader of the Opposition must not transgress and go further than he should, because I am not sitting on either side of the House. I am here in the chair to carry out my functions as required by the rules, and that is what I have done this afternoon.
Mr. Speaker,
I would rather he left it at that, but if he wishes to carry on, I won't stop him.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I haven't suggested otherwise. Mr. Speaker appears to have got the wrong end of the stick yet again. In fact, with the point that my honourable my friend Mr. Figueras was going to make. Mr. Speaker, the sole point that I was going to make is, last year there were substantial interruptions with my honourable friend Mr. Figueras. This year, unfortunately, for whatever reasons, there again has been an interruption. Mr. Speaker has read from Erskine May, and the sole point that I was going to make before Mr. Speaker asked me the question that he did, was that in fact Mr. Figueras was just simply going to make the point that the Honourable Sir Peter Caruana had made in the course of exchanges, and therefore he could move on. That's the only point that I was going to make, bearing in mind, Mr. Speaker, that this is the second year that there appears to have been controversy, quite frankly, I believe, unrelated to Mr. Figueras.
Mr. Speaker, if I may, can I just invite the honourable gentleman to accept that we have listened to Mr. Figueras and not interrupted him, because there's been no reason to. We would quite happily have interrupted him if we felt that there was. But can I just invite him and every member of the House to consider that when we interrupt each other, we interrupt each other. But then when Mr. Speaker asks us to sit, he's actually usually just giving us guidance or asking us to stick to the rules. And can I just invite him also to think that the discussion I've had with the Honourable Sir Peter Catalano has actually been a very useful one about the issue and not one that we should have wanted to avoid.
Perhaps Mr. Selwyn Figueras would care to carry on.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful and will say only that, as the honourable Leader of the Opposition has indicated, the arguments raised so eloquently by the Honourable and learned Sir Peter Caruana are in fact the only arguments that I was going to be dealing with in that respect, Mr. Speaker, as it is clear, and I was going to concede, of course, the point that had already been rehearsed, and only in reply, Mr. Speaker, because this had not originally been in my set-piece speech, only in reply to the comments that the Honourable Minister himself made yesterday and brought to this debate, Mr. Speaker, was the only reason why I was going to be dealing with that particular point. However, I'm satisfied that the point is sufficiently well made and debated, and we'll move on, Mr. Speaker. In relation to transport, I now turn to I had just dealt with planning, in case everyone else had forgotten, given the fact that it's been so long since I was actually dealing with that particular point. I am now turning to my shadow responsibilities for transport. I continue to enjoy a very positive discourse with my honourable friend, the Minister for Transport, and I turn first to our buses. I am grateful for the announcement that the new buses will be with us in short order, as we have discussed, the current fleet has provided the community with a bus service to be proud of for coming up on 10 years, I think it was. And despite the servicing needs of an ageing fleet, the service is still one we can mostly be proud of. In talking about the buses, however, Mr. Speaker, a quick review of passenger numbers is quite apropos. There has been a decline in the number of bus passengers generally, Mr. Speaker, in the order of about 13% year-on-year between 2012 and 2013, and this is taken from information that's available online and a brief comparison that I've made. There's also been, it's interesting that there may be a variety of factors other than the buses themselves suffering from a general lack of appeal in respect of those figures. Clearly, I mean, one could speculate that the number of passengers on our buses might be detrimentally affected by the issues we have been experiencing since our neighbours to the north started applying additional pressure at the border. A review of bus passenger numbers suggests, Mr. Speaker, if there has indeed been such an effect on the numbers, it was in fact a beneficial one, interestingly enough. Bus passenger numbers were, for the period of time between January and July of 2013, down on the same period in 2012. In fact, in July 2012, the number of passengers on the buses was 238,000, and in the month of July 2013, a comparatively few 190,000 used the buses. A decrease in the order of 50,000 passengers in the same month, year on year, or 20% less. In August, however, August last year, one can observe how the numbers year on year equalize and how from September to November, passenger numbers are indeed up last year on 2012. I suspect this had a lot to do with the cross-frontier workers and tourists alike leaving more of their cars in La Linea to avoid the worst of the queuing. Following the commencement of works on the artificial reef, which I note is forecast to have cost us in the region of £241,000 last year, but in respect of which there is only a token figure of £1,000 provision in respect of next year. I suppose that will have to grow ever slightly bigger to replace the concrete block we seem to have lost yesterday, Mr. Speaker. The above notwithstanding, the number of bus users overall is down 13% between 2012 and 2013, and again I only have the figures from January to May for this year, and it shows that for the same period this year, the picture has only marginally improved. I am hopeful that with the introduction of the new buses, which the honourable member has indicated today, but I can confirm he had revealed to me in private earlier, certainly, would start as early as September this year. We might see an increase in appetite for the use of public transport because, frankly, Mr. Speaker, the more people we have in buses, walking or cycling, the less people we will have in their cars, and that will accrue to the benefit of us all. As far as the expenditure on public transport is concerned, I would like at this stage to raise a point about the treatment of the contribution to the Gibraltar Bus Company at head 44 of the estimates book. Mr. Speaker, historically, which is to say, until this year, we've always been provided with a breakdown of which company has received what, and perhaps the Father of the House might be able to assist in this in terms of the Chief Minister's reply, whenever that may come. We've always been provided with a breakdown at head 44 of which company has received what by way of contribution out of the consolidated fund. As an example, we know that of the £17.7 million that government contributed to its own companies last year, 2.7 million went to the Gibraltar Bus Company for the 2013-2014 financial year, and that 3.7 million went to the Gibraltar car parks, and so on. All we know this year is that the forecast outturn for this entire head, as head 44, is £20 million, and that the estimate for next year is £25 million. What we don't have is an analysis of where that has gone or is going. Another point I would make, Mr. Speaker, is that the expenditure of the government-owned companies is nowhere to be found, and would add that to see this information, or at the very least have the breakdown I've just referred to, would be very helpful indeed. Having dealt with the buses, Mr. Speaker, I would turn to talk about cycling generally and the Gibby Bike scheme specifically. Financial cover for this project is to be found at subhead 5, subhead ZQ, within the Improvement and Development Fund, on a list of disappearing heads, much to my dismay, Mr. Speaker. There was no provision for this last year, and it is disappointing to see its departure from the estimates book due for next year. You see, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Minister for Transport, a minister with whom, as I have already said, I enjoy a very positive relationship, and in whom I have discovered a politician genuinely willing to work with his counterpart in opposition. There are others too. And I have been at loggerheads on this issue since the very beginning of this Parliament. I have appreciated and continue to appreciate that he is happy to keep me informed of developments in a variety of matters without the need for those matters to come before this House on a monthly basis. But we do disagree, I think, on the importance of an urban bicycle rental scheme like Gibby Bikes was. You see, Mr. Speaker, it is patently obvious to me and the rest of my parliamentary colleagues on this side of the House that part of the political strategy of this government has been to dismantle those parts of the GST legacy which could, in their view, reasonably be dismantled, in addition to the other strategic elements of knocking what they couldn't and blaming us for all that may have gone wrong during their term of office. This is clearly not an indictment on the Minister himself, Mr. Speaker, but on the policy that he has adopted as part of the government, ostensibly in consultation with the Cabinet in relation to the Gibby Bikes. Mr. Speaker, I will concede that the scheme as created in 2011 became problematic soon after launch. Its difficulties, both practical and contractual, which made it difficult for the scheme to succeed, notwithstanding its popularity and the growing membership it enjoyed, despite quickly becoming a substandard facility. I bemoaned, and continue to bemoan, its demise, mostly because I am of the view that had there been genuine political will to either keep it alive or to provide an alternative not beset by the problems of the original, it could have been so. It would not have been without its cost, Mr. Speaker, I recognise that. If one were to speculate, given the cost of the original scheme, that a new one might have set us back between £300,000 and £400,000, would it not have been a valuable and worthy investment, particularly in light of the many other projects where this government is spending so much more? As a solution designed to get people out of their cars and onto an eco-friendly alternative for getting around, Gibby Bikes was ticking all the boxes. And if they were willing to spend £3 million on Commonwealth Park, £23 million on a small boat berth marina, and we're looking at spending in the order of £5 million, well, that's pure speculation, for new buses, why then could they not justify the expense of a new urban bicycle rental scheme? I suspect that there may have been some concern for the Honourable, the Father of the House's health, had he been approached for approval of an expense of that order for the survival or replacement of a GST legacy project, and that, occupied as he must have been with the project actually in his own manifesto, that the Minister for Transport was certainly not going to allow himself to be distracted further by something of our own making. I understand all that, Mr. Speaker, I do. But it would have been the right thing to do, and I would have done nothing but congratulate him and his government for investing in that. It is unfortunate that I am standing here today and that Gibraltar has effectively, in that respect, taken a step back when such an important step forward had been taken in 2011. I also note from a review of the Honourable Minister's intervention last year that the bus company had created a website, and this is a point that may be of interest to the Honourable Minister. He also mentioned that a Facebook page and a mobile-optimised version of that site had been created, and of these things I know a thing or two. Whilst I congratulate the Honourable Minister and the bus company on the Facebook page, which is very convenient and very useful in terms of keeping its passengers up to date with information and impact on the service, I regret to say that the website, certainly from a mobile perspective, when really it would be at its most useful when you're on the move and you need to get information about the routes and other relevant information, leaves a lot to be desired. From the fact that the information it contains is cumbersome and unhelpful to the fact that the mobile optimization has clearly, and this is important, been done using a freely, cheaply available online converter, Mr. Speaker, it does leave a lot to be desired. In fact, I think a cursory review of it by the Minister even now will help him to see how third-party advertising lumped in with the use of this kind of free mobile conversion tool online is present on the page, and frankly, does Gibraltar's image and that of our bus company probably no favours whatsoever. So I would urge the Honourable Minister to review that at some point soon. In relation to the issue of taxi drivers and the quality of the taxi service, Mr. Speaker, I have been having a number of meetings with a variety of representatives from a variety of organisations, all of them stakeholders in the successful delivery to Gibraltar of an integrated public transport infrastructure in which we all work together to deliver the best solution for Gibraltar PLC as part of the opposition's outreach programme. I share the government's wish that the initiatives that they have set upon in consultation with the industry will prove successful. As part of our continuing outreach programme, I will continue to meet with these representatives from all sectors affected by matters of public transport and will clearly keep a watchful eye on developments in this area and raise those issues which I may consider worthy of note. One thing is clear, Mr. Speaker. It does this community no favours for the political representatives in this regard to be unnecessarily at loggerheads, and I believe that working to assist rather than to hinder efforts in this area can help bring benefits to the community at large. I now turn, Mr. Speaker, rather briefly, I will admit, given the lack of an address from the Traffic Minister himself before mine, to traffic. Fortunately, on traffic, Mr. Speaker, there really is very little of note to speak of, other than in relation to the Sustainable Traffic and Transport Management Plan. The plan has been heralded as the answer to all the traffic questions this community may have, but it seems that only the government and a few other select people actually know what's contained within it. As an example of the lack of activity, there's a provision of £155,000 in the Improvement and Development Fund for this year for traffic enhancements, yet only £10,000 have been spent. Why the lack of spending? Everyone else was doing it, Mr. Speaker. I also note that nothing has been spent on motorcycle safety campaigning either, Mr. Speaker, which, given the implementation of the Driver Licensing Directive, potentially allowing individuals to access to large, powerful bikes without the EU required level of experience, would, I think, be even more important. I am not persuaded, and neither am I satisfied, that the implementation of the third Driver Licensing Directive, a matter which I have raised in this House on a number of occasions, Mr. Speaker, has been done in an EU-compliant way. It is a matter, Mr. Speaker, that I fully intend to have reviewed when the GSD is returned to office in 2015. The Sustainable Traffic and Transport Management Plan is a matter of some mystery and intrigue, when it should really be something that we are all aware of as an exercise that they claimed would be conducted in public. All that was done in public was to stop people by the roadside at peak travel times for a few weeks last year, and nothing else has been heard about it. I said it last year in my address to this House, and I will say it again. This is clearly about the GSLP Liberal government applying taxpayers' money to the purchase of some inspiration for the traffic section of their 2015 manifesto. They have nothing left to give, Mr. Speaker, hence the search for ideas. On that basis, and until such time as we have had sight of the initiatives that stem from the study, it may happen in 5 minutes' time, we will only be able to assess the value of this expense standing at around £340,000 when we know what impact we will observe in the daily traffic difficulties most in this community experience. I will certainly be happy to congratulate, and do congratulate, in fact, the government for the construction and delivery of the multi-storey car park at Eastern Beach, which, from personal experience, is a welcome addition in the area. The development of that site, prompting the construction of the parking, is certainly something for which many will be grateful. Just one cautionary note. Given the government's stance on all things Spanish and the current situation, it might do well to procure English language printed tickets for the facility. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, this is... Yes, very droll.
What's a penny here or there?
Indeed. Penny-wise, pound foolish. Mr. Speaker, I will now take a couple of minutes to conclude in saying that this is the third occasion on which I have the honour and the privilege of addressing this House on the Appropriation Bill. an opportunity to speak to the electorate in a manner which enables the opposition to express its view on all aspects of government activity, and, where appropriate and indicated, to provide the electorate with a glimpse of what they can expect from their opposition, should they seek to entrust us with government office in little more than a year's time. The Chief Minister, in his budget address as leader of the opposition in 2011, accused his predecessor of being concerned with nothing but the election. He said, and I quote, "It is just plain and simple, plain and cynical. Election, election, election. Using taxpayers' money to buy taxpayers' votes." He made that charge just 3 years ago from these opposition benches. And yet the last 2.5 years, their whole term of office, have been characterized by a spending bonanza, Mr. Speaker. Buying votes from the off, y eso que no había dinero. There was no money, Mr. Speaker. I suppose it's a case of easy come, easy go, Mr. Speaker, because everybody knows that the reality is that this government inherited a community with solid public finances and an economy growing steadily in difficult global conditions. So, of course, he embarked on his spending spree, exhibiting all of the hallmarks of the original GSLP administration, with a vision for re-election and nothing else. The Honourable, the Father of the House, must be beside himself with anger at the loss of control over the public finances. It pains me to say it, Mr. Speaker, but I will. At least in this respect, Gibraltar might have been in safer hands had he been able to hang on to the purse strings, Mr. Speaker. It's almost as if the fox has been put in charge of the hen house, Mr. Speaker. On another note, you will recall that in my address to this House last year, Mr. Speaker, I took the opportunity of raising a number of issues in respect of which I then offered this party's view of how they should and could be dealt with. I was, last year, the only member, and it seems this year so far, to be interrupted in this House on a number of occasions, which interruptions, Mr. Speaker, with respect, you rightfully declared inappropriate given the opposition's decorum during interventions by all other ministers last year and generally in this House. Just today, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Minister has now announced the Proceeds of Crime Act that they will be seeking to pass during this financial year, which is a source of satisfaction for me, particularly in light of the reaction that a suggestion of such legislation received last year. In fact, it was one of the causes of the interruptions, I seem to recall. The Chief Minister then took it upon himself to launch into a personal attack on me for having had the temerity to suggest that not everything about Gibraltar under GSLP Liberal rule is as perfect as they'd like for us to believe it is. He prefaced his attack by saying how he had still retained some affection for me, Mr. Speaker. It's probably for the better that he had, because I cannot imagine, or rather I shudder to think, how much more he might have embarrassed himself if he hadn't. He makes a point of misinterpreting my light-hearted approach to all but the most serious issues that we deal with here as a lack of seriousness or respect for the whole of this place. It was somewhat surprising, if I'm honest, Mr. Speaker, to observe how personally he had taken what I had carefully constructed to be as balanced and positive an intervention as I could muster, without being accused of laying the groundwork for crossing the floor. His reply last year was in stark contrast with when the Honourable the Chief Minister was sat on this side of the House and yearned for things to be done differently. He'd say things like, and I quote, "Would that we could do that, Mr. Speaker, in relation to the debate on the state of the nation, without having to watch the Leader of the House, in his reply, perform the spectacle of hurling insults to those of us assembled on these benches and not answering the substance of any of the points raised." End quote. Funny then, Mr. Speaker, how just last week on Wednesday afternoon, and I'm trying to be somber just so that he gets that I'm actually being serious about it and that I'm not being light-hearted, that just last week on Wednesday afternoon, a week ago, Mr. Speaker, in relation to supplementaries, being asked in respect of, I think, the first question of the day, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister said from a sedentary position, "Deja que los coja," wait till I get them, Mr. Speaker, in English. In this morning's session, he said, "Me voy a hartar con ello," from a sedentary position. I'm going to have my fill with them from a sedentary position. I can't think of a better translation, if I'm honest, Mr. Speaker. It is rather a charitable one, I think, frankly. But I mean, really, Mr. Speaker, what is that all about? A threat of what exactly? A tongue lashing, Mr. Speaker? I mean, who does he think he is? I mean, he is a man, Mr. Speaker, no more. One who happens to lead this community, and proudly so he should, of 30,000. by virtue of which position he owes everyone in this chamber and the rest of the community at large the duty of directing the community's affairs for the benefit of everyone in it. But to hear him utter those words last week, Mr. Speaker, as if they might strike fear in our hearts and dissuade us from our line of questioning, it was a sad indictment of what I fear he appears to have become, relishing the opportunity he would soon have to show everyone who's boss. The thing is, Mr. Speaker, that his reply last year, his general demeanour and approach to business conducted here, exemplified by his throwaway comments last week, only confirmed that in his brief term of office so far, the Chief Minister appears to have been consumed by the office which he holds, acting like he's been in that chair for most of his professional life and not, as is the case, a few short years. The Chief Minister has readily, on a number of occasions, sought to justify his venom in this House by saying that his predecessor sought to ruin him and that the Honourable and Learned Sir Peter Caruana had charged him with being unfit to be Chief Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, that was in response to precisely the same charge he levelled at the Honourable Sir Peter Caruana himself, quoting de Gaulle and saying that he had all the spite but none of the statesmanship. Mr. Speaker, I wonder whether he considers his reply in the budget debate last year was statesmanlike. In reply to the honourable member's charge, the Honourable Sir Peter Caruana explained that both by a combination of the ignorance he displays and the deceit to which he sees fit to resort, he is unfit to be Chief Minister of Gibraltar. If I have learnt one thing in the short time that I have had the honour of serving this community in this House, in particular during the honourable member's reply in the budget debate last year, is that separating personal from political is something that the Chief Minister is either unable or unwilling to do. What's more, Mr. Speaker, I have learnt that the Honourable and Learned Sir Peter Caruana's judgment of the current incumbent at number 6 Convent Place may have been, but by reason of his venom and unflinching determination to eliminate anyone who may speak out against his politics, and frankly to my disappointment, entirely spot on. If last year's reply by the Honourable the Chief Minister was, Mr. Speaker, if last year's reply by the Honourable the Chief Minister was personal, Mr. Speaker, this year I expect nothing less from the Honourable member. I would have thought that he will want to denigrate, insult, and attempt to humiliate us even more. Judging by the reaction to last year's diatribe, he should feel free to go ahead and do his worst. Each insult and every poisonous remark helps us to show the rest of the electorate the serious problem that afflicts our community at the heart of our government. The Chief Minister, Mr. Speaker, might recognise some of those last few words. He himself wrote and delivered the same words as part of his address in this House in 2011 on the eve of the last election. How fortuitous then, Mr. Speaker, that already we can use the honourable member's own words against it. That, Mr. Speaker, appears to be the measure of the man. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.